You fill in the contract of sale after lengthy negotiations between the seller and the purchaser. The purchaser is happy to buy the property for 2 million rand. The document is sent to the purchaser to first sign, and thereafter, on the same day, you also receive back the document from the seller, who has in the meantime also signed it. Question is that a valid agreement where there are two separate documents containing the same contents, which were separately signed by the seller and the purchaser? Now, the question would obviously become relevant, particularly where one of the parties later decide not to proceed with the transaction. Let's say the seller later receives an offer for 2.1 million rand and decides that he rather wants to take the offer of the other purchaser and not proceed with your transaction. The question is, can you now enforce that agreement, even though it is contained in two separate documents? I think such an agreement would indeed be valid and enforceable. And one needs to look at Section 2, subsection 1 of the Alienation of Land Act. And I can maybe quote the section: "No alienation of land after the commencement of the section shall, subject to the provisions of Section 28, be of any force or effect unless it is contained in a deed of alienation signed by the parties thereto or by their agents acting on their written authority." So I would believe that even if there are two separate documents with the same content signed by the seller and the purchaser, such an agreement would indeed comply with Section 2, subsection 1 of the Alienation of Land Act. And I think in such a case, the purchaser would indeed be able to enforce such an agreement. I'm not aware of any particular case law dealing with that question. My advice would also be to, in any event, play it safe and rather get the parties to sign the same document, especially if there might be something in the agreement which indicates that the same document needs to be signed. Then there might be a problem if it's two separate documents. That would be the one option, to make sure that the agreement is indeed enforceable, get them to sign the same document. Another option would be, and that's actually a clause that we have included in our standard deed of sale, is to stipulate that the agreement could also be signed in counterparts, and to make it clear that even if the agreement is signed in counterparts, that it is still a valid and an enforceable agreement. Now, whilst we are talking about Section 2, subsection 1 of the Alienation of Land Act, I should maybe also point out the fact that the section doesn't refer to witnesses that have to sign. So if you have a contract of sale signed by the seller and the purchaser only, without any witnesses being present when they signed, and without any witnesses also signing the contract, then such an agreement is still valid, contrary to popular belief. Also important is the fact that if you have an agent signing on behalf of the seller or the purchaser, you need to have a written authority authorizing the agent to sign on behalf of the principal, in other words, the seller or the purchaser. So let's say the purchaser is in Australia, overseas, and he wants to instruct an agent to sign on his behalf. He can do so. He can sign a written power of attorney that can then be used by an agent to sign the agreement. The other option would be to simply send over, as I explained in another video or podcast, to Australia, and for him to sign over there, and then scan and email the agreement back to South Africa. That would also constitute a valid agreement.